All right. Good morning or good evening, everyone. Please sign in for the attendance. It's running now. We are almost done. With these classes that meet once a week, it's unusual, right? The semester feels like it doesn't even happen, but it goes by super quick. So here we are today, class 10. We're doing free exercise clause. Class 11, we're doing establishment clause. Class 12, we will finish establishment clause. The 15th will be our last in-person session. The reason why is that our last scheduled day is actually on Passover, so I will be exercising my religion, as it were. So we will not be having class. So to make it up to you, we'll do the final exam over Zoom. You don't have to be here. If you want to be here, that's fine. I will not be here, but you're welcome to be here over Zoom. Otherwise, I'll send you the link for that later. My hope is to go over one of my old exams. Now, I gave you all the opportunity to take an old exam and give it to your review. So far, 0 of you have done that, which doesn't surprise me. I know it happens every year. We say, "Oh, Professor, we review a sample question?" And then you never actually do it. It happens every year. I'm numb to it at this point. But I'm here if you want to take advantage of that. I'm happy to do it. Questions about anything? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, 7:45 p.m. Yes, no, I couldn't do it another time, unless you want me to. Now, there's no class that day, so I guess I could do it earlier. Actually, I didn't think about that. So on Wednesday the 24th, again, Passover is Monday and Tuesday. I can't do either of those days. So Wednesday's the first day I could do it. That's a reading day. There are no exams that day, right? The 24th. Who here would want to do it closer to 5 or 5:30? Who here could not do it at 5 or 5:30? So everyone, if I started at 5 or 5:30, you could do it that time. All right. When you guys finish work, I don't want to mess with your work schedule. Who has actually a commute, whatever, still resume 5:30? That would be okay. All right. Let me just make a note. 5 or 5:30. I don't know which one for sure, but it'll be around that time. You don't have to be until 10 p.m. I'll figure a way to make that work. No. It's I didn't think about it, but you're right. We can do it earlier. Okay. That work for everyone. Is there one conflict with that? You can't do it 5 5:30, but you could do 7:45. I think everyone's here. Everyone's spoken for. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll figure out a time for sure once I figure out my schedule, and then we'll do it that day. All right. So let's focus on the first sentence of the first clause of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There's a relationship between these two clauses that is not always obvious to students, and I want to tease that out. So, Amy, I'll start with you. In our cases today, the justices discuss a tension between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. What is that tension they keep talking about?
It was confusing to me
I know.
because they seem to use them interchangeably.
I know they did. Was the second case an establishment clause case or a free exercise case? I know they did, and you haven't learned it yet. It's hard to teach this topic. So what is this tension? I want to sort of tease this out.
Maybe that exercising, but
It's okay. No one ever gets us the first go.
I'm really confused by it because reading the second case, I was like, okay, we're not to that topic yet.
I know you're not, but think about it, okay? So, Jonathan, let's try it like this. Tension. What does it mean in the abstract for the government not to establish religion? What does that entail?
The government does not endorse certain religions through like rulings or statutes.
Okay. And how might what you just described, not endorsing religion, how does that affect the free exercise of religion?
It may make certain religious sects have more difficulty in procuring funding, where other sects that the government.
And that's SECTS, just so everyone knows. I'm in there. Just go ahead. Sex. You're right. No, you're good.
No, where other sects that the government has statutes on the books that would that are favorable to them.
Okay, so good. That's good to start. Okay, so Jonathan says, if the court takes too strong, I'm sorry, not the court. If the government takes too strong of avoiding the Establishment Clause violation, they risk perhaps burdening free exercise rights. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
All right, Anna, let's flip it. What happens if the government does a lot to protect the free exercise of religion? What might happen then?
Sometimes by protecting one religion, they might offend another religion.
And why is that problematic? Offending someone?
Or maybe it's not like offending, but by protecting one exercise, the other group might not be able to exercise theirs. And in a way, they're establishing a religion.
A single. Okay. So I think Jonathan and Anna gave 2 points. I just wanted to make. Oh, Shania, that's you don't have to do that. You can use your computer for notes. That's fine. I appreciate the gesture. You are so considerate. The other people don't even care, right? It's okay. That's very considerate. Anyway, but so Jonathan and Anna, I think, gave 2 answers, right? If the government goes too far in the direction of avoiding an establishment religion, that is, they say we are so afraid of establishing religion that we're not giving any benefits to religious people at all. If you're not religious, you get whatever you want, but if you're religious, you get nothing, right? That's kind of like the main case, right? That might be a free exercise violation. But on the other side, imagine government is so protective of religion, and maybe one religion in particular, that they actually might be establishing that religion as a state religion. So in the process of protecting free exercise, you might run afoul of the Establishment Clause. Amy, you see the tension?
Yeah.
This is the tension that has existed since 1791, right? This is not new. This is not something that William Brennan or John Roberts or Stephen Breyer invented, right? This is an inescapable aspect of religion in the state. If you do too much to protect religion, you might run afoul of the Establishment Clause. If you do too much to avoid entanglement with the religion, you might burden free exercise rights. All right. So I'll come to you, Adi. In the second case, there's not the majority. It's in Justice Breyer's dissent. There's discussion of the play in the joints. Play in the joints. What is that play in the joints?
Well, it's basically like what we were just talking about. Like if you like the play in the joints is like well, it's like what we were just saying. Like when you are like like when can you like ask it again?
Describe the play in the joints. What is that? Play in the joints. What does that mean?
The play in the joints means like the way that the two intersect, where you make them like work together, like problems that they create. So like the issues that come up and the way that you.
Well, let me give more particular. In the context of providing vouchers, for example, for a religious school, what if the government's afraid that, maybe giving this voucher won't establish religion, but we should try to avoid it anyway? What does a play in the joints say about that?
Well, that if you're just trying to, what Breyer says about that, or
Sure, either way.
Well, if their government is trying to avoid, or if they're trying to like make sure that the vouchers don't touch religion at all,
then what it's basically doing is then it's saying that like no religion can.
So let me put it this way: if you have leeway, right? But which leeway does it cut? Is it cut more in favor of avoiding establishment, or more in favor of protecting free exercise? Which way does this leeway cut?
Well, for Breyer, it cuts more if you don't want to establish anything, so you rather burden religion than
Okay. Okay, good.
establish.
Okay, good. All right, so I think the four of you more or less got what I was looking for. For really the entirety of the 20th century, right? Starting in the 1940s or 50s, when this started getting going, when there was a conflict between church and state, the court would consistently err on the side of avoiding an Establishment Clause violation, right? It was a very, even liberal conservative justices you'll see were pretty much the same. They were so concerned that an entanglement or an endorsement, to use Jonathan's language, between the church and state might create some bad consequence. We'll talk about those consequences in a minute. They were so worried about those bad consequences, they told the government, look, even if this policy may not actually be unconstitutional, you can still take it, right, to avoid to avoid entangling the government and religion, right? You put a thumb on the scale. The thumb was on the scale of let's try to avoid establishing religion, even if that does burden religion. So let's say, an easy example, right? Let's say that there's a policy where the government wants to provide textbooks for schools, right? Secular textbooks, math, science, whatever, right? And we'll provide those textbooks to a religious school also. Well, you can't do that, right? Because that might entangle government religion. They'll have to look at the curriculum, see what they're teaching, right? See what they're using these books. We just don't want to get involved with this. That there's such a fear of what happens when church and state mingle that even if there's a burden on religion, too bad. That was a dynamic for really the entirety of the 20th century. But in the last, 6 or 7 years or so, the court has done a 180. Justice Sotomayor said, "What a difference 5 years makes." She said that a couple times already, right? 5 years is like the guide. She said that in 303 Creative also. And the Roberts Court basically flipped the dynamic. Whereas once the play in the joints favored avoiding Establishment Clause violations, now the sort of the loaded dice, if you will, is to avoid burdening religion. And just put this perspective, the holding in Carson against Makin was that the government must provide funding to religious schools. If this same issue had come to the court, let's say 40 years ago, the court would have said it's unconstitutional to provide this funding. Just want to put that in perspective. What is constitutionally required today would have been unconstitutional 40 years ago. That's just stunning. You can tell why Sotomayor and Breyer just gobsmacked, like, whoa, what happened to my court? Right? In many ways, the Trump justices have been, perhaps not as conservative as some have hoped for. But at least on this issue, there's not much daylight between the court's conservatives. And if you read the Sotomayor dissent in Carson, they've more or less winnowed away the Establishment Clause to almost a nullity. It doesn't do much anymore. So short of overt endorsement of religion, right, or like, adopting one particular faith, the doctrine has very little teeth. Next week, we'll do a case called Kennedy versus Bremerton, which involves a football coach praying on the sidelines. And there the court gets rid of the so-called Lemon test, which we'll study about soon. Actually, it's in 2 weeks with the Lemon test. The religion clause doctrine has shifted the most of the last 20 years of anything else on the court. Or other things have been pretty stable, speech, whatever, but religion has just changed radically. Let me just double down. Smith. Who wrote in Point Division versus Smith? St. Nino, right? Justice Scalia, perhaps the most conservative member of the court in recent years, after Thomas. And who joined him? All the court's conservatives joined Scalia. Meanwhile, who wants to overrule Smith now in Fulton? Alito, Gorsuch, Thomas, the court's conservatives. How could it be that in the span of about 30 years, what was once viewed as a conservative doctrine is now being not just opposed, but overruled by the court's progressives, the court's conservatives? Thankfully, for perhaps the Justices Breyer and Kagan, Kavanaugh and Barrett didn't go along with it. So otherwise, it's been 5 votes to overrule Smith. Right, the vote in Fulton was basically 9-0 on the bottom line. And as we know with John Roberts, there's a price to pay. You get a unanimous court because they don't do what you want them to do, right? They kind of get this middle thing where no one's happy. But if Kavanaugh and Barrett had thought differently in Fulton, Smith would be gone. Like this close. So really, it's teaching this class today is so different than teaching it 3 years ago. I'm not even kidding you. I taught this class last in 2020 or maybe 21, completely different class. Some things don't change very much. For First Amendment free speech, it's more or less the same. But this topic is just radically altered in a short period. A lot of law professors are like, I don't want to teach this. I don't want to teach it. Whatever. They're complaining. Teach what you got. This is the law we have. I don't like everything I teach, but I do it anyway. All right. Questions so far? All right. So we have 2 cases today. Now let's see how closely you pay attention. I thought of this question before. Let's see if it works. Sorry, Nick. You're next. What do both these cases have in common? He's laughing at you. You're next. You just.
I know.
You're batting cleanup.
Broadly, or
I don't know. It's a question. What do both these cases have in common? A couple of things, but we'll see what you get.
they both deal with, let's see, establish or freedom of expression, but it will have to do with the. No, I was gonna say the use, but that's the second case.
Mm-hmm. It's not in your notes. If it is, that's super good notes. But I don't think it's in your notes. What do these both cases have in common?
That, what, if they sidestep the main issue, like about overruling.
Oh, that's John Roberts. He says it all the time. No, that's not what I'm looking for. You're right. That's what I'm looking for. We'll put it this way. What do the facts have in common in both cases? What was the government doing in both cases that really ticked off the Roberts court? Jamar?
And first, I was gonna say yes, in both cases, the government was acting as a manager of certain benefits.
You are on the right track. Okay. And in that capacity as a manager, how did they act?
They tried to compel an agency to do something.
Was anyone being compelled to do anything here?
Well, in the first one, they said if you don't allow same-sex couples to adopt children, you can't have this contract.
Where was the compulsion?
I guess they were just saying, do we want to not get the benefit?
Okay, you're on the right track. Cody, I'll come back. Oh, yeah, you want to go?
I'll let him try first.
Nick, you want to give us that?
Well, was it the fact that it's kind of like the Sherbert case where they're like pinning, like they're giving ultimatums?
You're right, but that's what I'm looking for. You're close. So, Cody, let me ask you this way. In both cases, when the government's acting as a manager, use Chamar's words, okay? Who is the government treating favorably and who is the government treating unfavorably?
Different categories of people. So,
Be more precise.
like the religious organizations were being treated unfavorably, and
non-religious organizations are not, they're like making exceptions.
Everyone repeat that. You just gave me the right answer. One more time.
Religious organizations are unfavorable, being treated unfavorably, and non-religious were getting favorable treatment. The government making exceptions.
Everyone see that? He's exactly right. And we'll get to the facts in a minute. I want to just provide the overview. In both of these decisions, the government was treating non-religious entities more favorably than religious entities. So in Philadelphia, if you were a secular, non-religious foster agency, yeah, you got the benefits of placing these children. But if you were the Catholic Social Services, you got nothing. You get kicked out. And in Maine, if you were a private school, a military academy, whatever, right? You got the benefits of these vouchers. But if you were a religious school, you did not. If everyone got that similarity. All right, this next one's gonna be a little bit harder. All right, Dylan, you know you're going to eventually, right? In both cases, there's a similarity. Why did the government treat the religious entities less favorably than the non-religious entities? Why, or say, we'll make it easier, why were the non-religious groups treated more favorably than the religious groups? In both cases, there's a reason.
Because somebody at the state level said so.
Well, sure. I mean, that's the reason why they were executed. But what was the motivation? Made the question more precise. Why did the government choose to treat the religious groups worse than the non-religious groups? Oh, I'm forgetting. Yeah, you're on deck.
I don't know. I mean, I would not both cases. I would maybe the first case because of a suspect class,
Who was suspect?
the same-sex couples.
Well, but I'm asking why they treated their Catholic services less favorably, not the parent, the adopted parents.
Yeah, out of protection of the suspect class is what I was thinking, but that wouldn't apply to both.
Well, but why would they think that suspect classes would be harmed? You're tiptoeing around it. Jake?
Was it to avoid religious strife? They were afraid that if they let them continue on how they've been going, that their citizens would be displeased.
Was that an issue in the first case? Definitely was in the second case.
I thought it was an issue in the first case because they've been continuing on how they had been for, was it like 40, 50 years, something like that. And it wasn't until the archdiocese went on the news and sort of told everybody how they were practicing that the city wanted to investigate them. And
Right, but for generations in Philadelphia, it would have been unthinkable to even place a child with a gay couple. Just that would not have even been something you would ever think about. What changed?
society,
What do you mean society changed?
well, we became more accepting of those practices.
Who's you say we?
Society.
That's the royal we. Who's we?
Oh, how did they put it? The moral majority?
Moral majority. Is that what we call a Bergefell? Moral majority? Yeah. Shania, what happened then in the decades since they began offering the service? And why did Philadelphia sort of change it soon? I think Jake gave me the right answer. I'm just trying to pin it down a little bit more precisely.
Well, society's values changed, and so as the makeup of the U.S. changed, I would assume that the opinions of the court changed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you're telling me about the court. I'm asking about in Philadelphia, right? What was the view about the Catholic services hasn't changed, right? They're the ones saying the same. So you're saying the people around them have changed. So maybe what was once a religious majority position has now become a religious
Outlier? I don't know.
minority, outlier, sure. Okay. Kevin, let me ask you the same question. this is sort of buried in the case, but it's there. One of the reasons why Maine denied vouchers to these schools, or these Christian schools in particular, is because some of their views. What were some of the religious views that maybe triggered denying them these vouchers? This is mentioned in the case, in the dissent in particular.
The second case in Maine.
Yeah. What is it that these religious schools did beyond strife, and Jacob's right, but beyond just general strife that perhaps the state cannot approve of, the legislature at least?
Well, they're providing religious instruction
Mhm.
on the taxpayer's dollar.
Can anyone attend the school?
As far as I understand, yes.
Can anyone work there?
Yeah.
Do they hire anyone of any faith to work there?
I believe so. I'm not sure. I think so.
No.
They only hired born again Christians, and their admissions were limited.
Will they hire a gay or lesbian person to work there? All right, so I'll ask the question again, Eric. I think we're getting closer now. So for decades, if a religious school would not hire a gay person without an issue that anyone would even bat an eye at. In 30 years ago, if a religious school said, we're not hiring any gay people, would that have even made any controversy? But today it does, right?
I guess the legislature's views.
So then what changed? This goes back to the question that Jake gave me a minute ago, and then Shania a minute ago.
Philadelphia throws out there. I know that they got backlash from news.
Sure. My question is much simpler. What changed over the decades that made it now that they were concerned about this religious institution not hiring people of a certain sexual orientation?
Views on sexual orientation.
Shania, want to try again?
Is it now that this is like a discriminatory practice and that's like
Was it
law now?
20, 30 years ago discriminatory practice?
I don't think so.
No, it's not. Nick?
Because of the Pope,
The Pope? What did the Pope do?
he changed like the religious views of the church.
Can popes do that? Any Catholics here? I'm not.
Unfortunately.
What do I know? I'm a Jew. What, 3 Jews, 4 opinions, as they say. Julianne? So it wasn't Anthony Kenny, it was Pope Francis. All right, let's put the Pope aside for a minute. Let's focus on the courts. I think we're actually really close to what I'm trying to get at. One of the ways to understand the sort of flip in society from 30 years ago is that was once a moral majority favoring traditional views on marriage has sort of flipped. And it's now those who favor traditional marriage are in the minority. Every one of these cases that we've had today and last week actually is about gay marriage. You may not realize it. 3-3 Creative, Fulton, and Carson. They're all about gay rights in the background. It's not obvious, but they are. People who don't favor sort of contemporary views on those issues. You may not remember Bergefell, but Alito had this one line where he said, perhaps in the future, people will to whisper, quiet about their views. They can't speak of in the public square. He was very deliberate on that. And then you can't separate that dynamic from here. That if you now favor traditional marriage, you're viewed as a bigot who are denied funding, and you can't even help to place children with foster parents. So even in the span of, I've been teaching here for 12 years. I started teaching in 2012. Windsor was in 13, and Bergefell, I think, was in 14 or 15. So even the decade I've been here, it's been just a world of change. It's amazing how quickly these things sort of shifted. But what we've seen is traditional views on marriage, which were once the majority, have now faded. For decades in Philadelphia, no one have even thought to take away a Catholic social services right to give children. That wasn't a thought. But today you have people saying, oh, be more like Pope Francis. And by the way, I don't know that the Pope's actually changed doctrine. They've talked to a lot of Catholics about this. Dispute about whether he has, but he's actually more vocal about it. That might be perhaps the difference. But as a doctrinal matter, I'm not sure how much has changed, but I don't maybe I'm wrong. Okay. That's what's lurking in the background of both these cases. And so when you have these discussions about free exercise, the marriage issue is never very far behind. Okay? Everyone get that? All right, good. That took 30 minutes. That's as much as expected. All right. All right, let's dive into the cases now. I know the reading's a little bit heavy today, but these cases are timely, so I'm sorry they were longer than usual. All right, Jamar, my friend, can you please give me the facts in Fulton?
So in Fulton, it was the Catholic Social Services where they had a practice for over 100 years of taking children from other agencies and putting them in homes with other families. And in dispute with the Philadelphia ordinance that said you can't discriminate based on race, creed, or religion.
Let me just pause you for a second. This is a public accommodation law, right? The same sort of law we had at 303 Creative, right? Is placing children a public accommodation? Why do you say no?
Because when they do the application, their information is displayed to everyone else, so you won't have your business displayed while you're at the bus stop.
That's what John Roberts says. Is he right about that? Do you agree with John? You can disagree with John Roberts. You're allowed to.
I agree.
You agree? Is building a website a public service? Wedding website. All right. So, Julian, you want to raise your hand?
Say in terms of public accommodation, you can argue that the foster program is because it serves.
You better believe it is. John Roberts makes stuff up, right? I hate to say this, but this is not political. It is political. He just makes stuff up. Tax, penalty, whatever. He just makes stuff up. When you read a John Roberts opinion, don't believe it. Right? I don't care which way it goes. And I like this case. I think he's still making stuff up. You know, I'm really being honest about it. I like this case. It reaches the right outcome. But I think Julian's right. This is absolutely a public accommodation. You're literally placing children with the wards of the state in the hands of parents. What the heck is more public than that? The public interest is there. So the idea that this is not a public accommodation has to be wrong. The court just punted on the issue. And again, 303 Creative, they punted on the issue also, whether public accommodation, they just didn't touch it. They don't want to say it. Why? Once they say that you have a First Amendment right to get a public accommodation law, that just opens the floodgates. They say, oh, it's not a public accommodation, not on a bus stop. Roberts has a skill. He writes so cleanly. Of course, this has to be right. And he's wrong. This is a public accommodation. So again, I like this case. Roberts is wrong about this. All right. Okay, thank you, Jamar. That was good for the facts. Okay. So, sorry. Again, just whenever you read a Roberts decision in which he's joined by Kagan, presume it's BS, right? Just presume they're just making stuff up to avoid ruling. Just a rule of thumb. Brian.
You're just gonna discount everything he says about how selective it is, what a part of his process is, how long it takes to become a foster parent, because public accommodation sort of implies that it's something that you can walk up, like he's saying. I mean, you can walk up and get on a bus. You can't just walk up and become.
If public accommodation was defined that narrowly, I would agree with you, but the courts have defined it extremely broadly. And actually, the dissent makes his point. This is really a matter for Pennsylvania Supreme Court, right? The U.S. Supreme Court can't decide what a public accommodation under state law. So in theory, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania could overrule this and abrogate this entire decision. They're not going to, right? In other words, whenever the court makes a ruling on the meaning of state law, that's not final. I'll give you a perfect example. A couple of years ago in Texas, we had the fetal heartbeat bill. Remember this one? SB 8, okay? And the majority of the court said, under Texas law, there was a certain type of procedure. And he said, you can sue to challenge this procedure, right? The facts are not important here. And then Justice Thomas said, wait a minute, why are we, the Supreme Court, interpreting a state statute? This belongs to the Texas Supreme Court. What happened? The Fifth Circuit certified the question to the Texas Supreme Court. And the Texas Supreme Court said, U.S. Supreme Court, you got it wrong. So the U.S. Supreme Court was overruled by the Texas Supreme Court. Go figure that one out. So again, the court is making a statement that is in dispute by all the parties on an issue of state law in which the state court has a final say. There's not a single case citation of how Pennsylvania defines public accommodations, just this line about a bus stop, which is why I'm saying he's so good. He's smooth. You just want to believe him. But you have to resist it. Anyway, but that's not important here. And I agree with this case. You know, I'm being honest, right? I like this case, and I just when I read this case, which was decided in 2021, I was like, really? Is this what we got? Anyway, okay. So another part of this record, though, speaking of Pope Francis, Aaron, what are some of the things that people in the Philadelphia government said about Catholicism and Pope Francis? What are some of the statements in the record that we have?
That it was, was it the Pope or was it? My recollection from the reading wasn't that it was Pope, it was that it was like a bishop of the archdiocese or something.
Well, sure, there's an Archbishop of Philadelphia, but who did the government officials say that Philadelphia should be more like? Who should they emulate?
Christ.
How about the Vicar of Christ? Does that work?
Yes.
Am I good? We got that one right? You know what the Vicar of Christ is? Fellow Jew, right? The Pope. What am I doing here? I don't even know. Everyone have a good Easter yesterday, by the way? Good Easter? Yeah? Okay. I gotta go shop for some matzah. Okay, so what's up with that? Easter is before Passover this year. What's up with that? Not for the Orthodox, but Easter is usually after Passover. Why? Because the Seder was the Last Supper. You all know that, right? Good. Anyway, I make this too hard for me. There were many statements in the record, people saying, "Oh, you need to be like more modern and be like more like Pope Francis, and you need to be more progressive on religion." Okay. Now, Julianne, would that be enough for a claim that they were targeting Christians for their religious belief or Catholics for their religious beliefs?
I would like to say no.
Okay, tell me why.
Because I think you can be critical or encouraging somebody to change their views without necessarily targeting them.
What does targeting mean? From Lukumi from last week? Thank you.
I think what they didn't really clearly define targeting, but essentially it was, I think the line was at grips with it.
Doesn't it show hostility to a traditional version of Catholicism? He's nodding.
As a person raised in Catholicism, I would have to say no, that it doesn't necessarily say
Okay.
animus. It just says that, hey, this is how somebody who is ahead of the church is viewing it.
So you're not being a good Catholic, you're being a bad Catholic.
Yeah.
Isn't that a problem, saying call someone a bad Catholic?
All the time, even Catholics.
Government, though. Can the government say you're being a bad Catholic?
So they can't necessarily say that your tenets of your faith, what they are, but
You're not being sincere? Are they challenging the sincerity of the Archbishop? All right, Cody, you were nodding your head. I'll just give you a chance to opine.
Like, do I think that it's an attack on the church?
Or at least the Archbishop, this specific, division.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the church has been in trouble a lot. Like, there's a bishop in Tyler that just got released
Excommunicated, yep.
for disagreeing with the Pope. But I think if you go back to anything that the Catholic Church has been taught before Pope Francis, then yeah, it's definitely an attack.
Yeah. What's unique about religion, and I'll make this one briefly, is who speaks for a religion. Catholicism is unique in that there's a top-down structure and that there's a guy. His name is Pope Francis. He's the dude, right? He speaks for religion. Other faiths are not so centralized, right? My own faith is anyone can be a rabbi, right? There's a million views. There's no single one teaching of what Judaism is. Different evangelical strains or different approaches, right? But Catholicism is somewhat unique in that there is one person. So to the extent of saying Pope Francis is preaching the true Catholicism and you're being inconsistent with him, that sounds a lot like targeting to me. Alito makes his point in his dissent, or partial dissent at least. Robert's like, we're not going to decide that, right? We're not going to decide if the people in Philadelphia government are targeting Catholics. Instead, Ryan, why does the court review with strict scrutiny the actions of the government here? What about the Philadelphia's action triggers strict scrutiny?
Because they're not.
What's the Smith test? What's the test from Smith that triggers strict scrutiny?
If you're categorically prohibiting everybody from discriminating against.
No, just give me what's the Smith test? Let's recap from last week. What's the Smith test? On the board. On the board all class.
If it's neutral or generally applicable law, then
Neutral.
it gets rational.
Is this law neutral? Is there animus? Use Julianne's word.
I mean, I don't think it's neutral because.
What does the court say? What does Robert say? Does the court decide this issue?
Do they decide it?
Yeah. Does the court decide whether this law is neutral or not?
I don't think they think it's neutral because they're the only.
Do they say whether it's neutral or not? They actually are very clear at this point. Leighton?
Trying to find it, but they said it was not.
No, they did not say that. Does John Roberts ever decide anything? Amy?
They never really said it.
He doesn't decide.
Yeah.
He doesn't even answer the damn question, right? Because he doesn't decide anything ever. It's just reading Robert's opinion is like just like seeing like a 0-calorie food. There's nothing there. You just leave hungry. It's just worse off than you were before, right? No, you're right. So again, the Smith test says if a law is neutral and generally applicable, we will use a rational basis, right? But if it's not neutral and it's not generally applicable, use a strict scrutiny standard. And what Kennedy said in Lukumi is that usually they're one and the same. If it's not neutral, it's not generally applicable. And if it's not generally applicable, it's not neutral. The court here does not decide neutrality. They do not decide, are you a bad Catholic line, right? They just don't decide it. Instead, Amy, on what basis do they decide this case? Or on what basis do they trigger strict scrutiny? Jonathan? What triggers strict scrutiny here if it's not neutrality? Aaron?
Is it the individualized exemptions?
Very good. Aaron, what makes this law, or I'm telling you a law, this policy, not generally applicable?
They're only applying it against this Catholic organization.
Your first answer is better.
Okay.
Say what you said before. That was correct. We just said was not.
Okay. They're deciding it on a case-by-case basis.
What are individualized exemptions? You gave me actually exactly right what I was looking for. What's an individualized exemption?
That's a great question.
It's a damn good question. Yeah.
They do not really describe it, but
they do.
Will know when they see it.
No, that they do describe it. Jonathan, want to take another stab? What are these individualized exemptions? Roberts made this part also up. Also, he completely made it up. Adi?
Well, individualized exemptions is when the government uses their discretion.
Good.
And so here there was in the contract a portion that like the government technically could make an exemption, or they could have exempted the CSS. They could have exempted them from it. But they never used it. There was no indication that they ever would, but that was technically what made it not generally applicable because
okay.
they could have granted an exemption.
Very good. Okay, so follow me here, right? Think back to Sherbert, right? The unemployment case. Did the government have the discretion to give Adele Sherbert an exemption and say, okay, that's fine. If you don't work on Saturday, we work on Sunday, we'll give you an exemption, right? Of course they did. Right? Every single unemployment case is done on a case-by-case basis. They're all individualized, and they had exemptions to create, power to create exemptions. All right. Now think of Smith, right? Mr. Smith broke the law. He used a controlled substance. Was there any discretion to give out an exemption in that case for breaking the law? I don't think so. Their hands were tied. So compare these two situations. One, Smith, you can't give an exemption. And two, sure, but you can. But you chose not to. So here's the thinking. If you can give an exemption to a religious group and you choose not to, the law is not generally applicable. I said again, if you have the discretion to give an exemption and you choose not to, the law is not generally applicable. And when the law is not generally applicable, you're stuck with strict scrutiny. So what that means is any discretion that you give to non-religion, if you don't give to religion, you're in trouble. So think about both these cases. Catholic Social Services was not given an exemption. Other groups may have been. In Maine, Christian schools were not given an exemption. Other schools were. That's the same threat in both cases. The court sees treating religion worse than non-religion. Treating religion worse than non-religion. Now, it doesn't exactly line up, but that's the sort of umbrella of what motivates the Chief Justice. Everyone see that? So let's think about this. So, Anna, let me come back to you. Or let me start with you then. What would it actually mean to give an exemption to some other group in this case? Were there any other groups in Philadelphia that wouldn't place kids with gay couples?
I don't think so.
No, there weren't. So what exactly is this business that you can grant an exemption? What's Roberts even talking about here?
It's something he's made up.
Mostly. Has anyone ever given such an exemption before?
No.
No. So what would they don't even put this in the opinion. He couldn't even hold his nose for that long. What would such an exemption be? Can you even think of it? Can anyone think of an example when you're placing children with a foster home, why you might want to discriminate in some sort of basis?
Criminal history.
Oh, that's not protected basis. Think of race, religion, ethnicity, disability, sex, or so on. Why might you give an exemption? Can you want to think of it? I'll give it if you can't. Tomorrow.
I guess you're afraid if you're going to be bullied for having two dads and mom.
Oh, I mean, that's an answer, but that's the opposite of what the government's doing.
Or
Yeah.
is it maybe, well, I guess depending on the age of the child, and if they are one religion and you place them with another religion.
Okay, so that's actually a huge issue they didn't talk about here, but that's a huge concern. What happens with custody battles when a parent wants to get remarried to someone of the opposite faith? Who gets custody? That actually arises a lot. I thought someone would say, well, if you don't have pair a kid with a black mom and a white dad, that's not unconstitutional. You can't do that. There was a time, but that's not allowed. So I'll give you an example. Disability. Let's say a couple comes and they're both quadriplegics and they want to adopt a foster a child. Usually you say you can't discriminate on the basis of disability, but, you know, as a father of young kids, mobility probably does help when you're raising kids. Not to diminish anyone's ability to parent kids, but the state might say, okay, you know what? Generally, we can't discriminate on the basis of disability, but yeah, we're going to grant an exemption here, and we're going to allow this not to go forward. So if you want to, when you're screening parents, you want to, not look at disabled couples with severe disabilities, we're going to allow that. So hypothetically, because the government could grant an exemption on the basis of disability, and they didn't give that same exemption to religion, that's unconstitutional. Everyone see the argument? Completely made up, right? This is the John Roberts special. I call it the blue plate special. He's whipped it all together, right? This is not actually what the case we have here. The litigant said overrule Smith. Philadelphia said, no, this is neutral. This is generally applicable. There is no targeting. We apply the law evenly. And because Roberts figured out that there was a possibility of an exemption, that can trigger strict scrutiny, and they don't have to worry about overruling Smith. Again, this was one of the least satisfying opinions I think I've read in modern years, where the court avoids what actually is there. Completely avoids it and just reaches and manufactures as number one, public accommodation. It's not a public accommodation. That's probably wrong. And number two, there's an exemption that no one's ever gotten before, and that triggers strict scrutiny. I'm sorry. I get angry with this topic, and I shouldn't, but it upsets me. Yeah, Cody.
But do you not fear if Justice Roberts didn't do it this way, he would overrule Smith, and it would be you'd be closer to establishing your religion for the country?
Do you think overruling Smith would do that?
Yeah, is that the whole fear? Like, isn't that what we're talking
The
about?
courting anarchy. Yeah, I'll get to them in a few minutes. I promise. I promise I'll get to that point. All right. So everyone just get the holding here, right? The court says we're not overruling Smith. We're going to apply strict scrutiny because the law is not generally applicable. The reason why it's not generally applicable is because it grants exemptions to some and not others. Even though no one's ever gotten this exemption, it's in theory possible. That's enough. And because we're in strict scrutiny, they can't exclude CSS from this program. And that's the holding. The majority opinion is actually very short. The other ones are quite long, so I gave you the readings the way it did. Now, I want to come to your question right now. Okay. This was a full frontal effort to overrule Smith. They put everything out there. This was the most sympathetic case. You have Catholic social services trying to help poor children in Philadelphia. They've been helping kids there for 200 years, right? This is a very good plaintiff, right? This is not like the guy who doesn't make the cake for the gay wedding, right? This is a sympathetic organization. And Kavanaugh and Barrett just didn't want to do it. We'll get to their concurrence in a minute. Now, one of the reasons why perhaps they didn't want to overrule it, was they worried about what would replace it, right? This is Barrett's point. Leading up to June of 2021, we had this thing called COVID. Remember this? And look, I'll be teaching this case in 10 years. Like, COVID? I don't remember that, right? Like my kids will not remember COVID. Thankfully, they were too young. They'll have no recollection of it. They'll see pictures. Right? They'll just never know what the hell this was. Why is mommy wearing a mask in that picture, right? They just won't know what that even is. But there were a lot of cases which are talked about in the Alito concurrence involving COVID. Okay. And actually, let's jump to that. Okay. During the pandemic, governments started exercising very broad powers to limit what types of institutions can remain open. Remember this? Yeah, I do. Right. So, for example, certain businesses were deemed essential. Right. Grocery stores, doctor's offices, laundromats, hardware stores, and the list sort of went on and on. A lot of these categories are somewhat arbitrary, but these were essential businesses. In some states, houses of worship were deemed essential. In other states, they were not. And in a series of cases that went up to the Supreme Court, at least at first, the Supreme Court said, when you're comparing, you must compare like to like. So, for example, if grocery stores are closed, grocery stores are open, but a church is closed, that's fine, because you can't really compare a church to a grocery store, right? They serve different functions, right? That was the approach of Chief Justice Roberts in a case called South Bay, which was a law for about 6 months. It was a concurrence, but he made it very clear that you have to compare a house of worship to like a theater, right? If a theater is closed and a house of worship closed, people gathering in the same place, that's okay. But then Justice Barrett came on the court in November of 2020. And one of the very first votes she ever cast was in a case called Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo. Okay. And this was a challenge to one of Governor Cuomo's lockdown orders, where they said basically churches in certain zones must be closed, right? Or they can only have very few people to make them basically unusable. Okay. There was a companion case involving synagogues in Brooklyn as well. Barrett cast a tie-breaking vote and adopted basically this framework of exemptions. And they said, if the government gives exemptions to some groups and not others, that triggers strict scrutiny. So, for example, a casino is allowed to open, but a house of worship is not. Well, why can't you give the same exemption to the casino as you could to the house of worship? Right? And so the court very quietly rewrote free exercise law. Right? That's not what Smith actually said. And actually, Alito calls Barrett in this. He says, wait a minute. This is a new rule. The idea that if any exemptions are given, that triggers strict scrutiny. That was the law generated by the COVID cases. So in effect, because the court modified Smith I think Barrett said there's no need to overrule it. There's very little that Smith does anymore after the COVID cases. Okay, so I'm getting to your question, right? So what the COVID cases say is that if there's any exemption given to non-religious group, you must give it to the religious group. Justice Kavanaugh described as the most favored nation approach, right? That if someone gets this preference, you must give it to religion. You cannot treat religion worse than non-religion, even if they're not really comparable, right? Even if a house of worship is not really like a grocery store or a restaurant, right? I think Barrett has limits on this. So I don't think Barrett's actually afraid of courting anarchy, as Scalia said to overrule Smith. Instead, I think she thinks that we got basically what we wanted through the COVID cases, and we don't need to go that far. But what would replace Smith? What does Alito say? Strict scrutiny, right? Which is not much different than what we have now. If you want to see what the world looks like without Smith, you look to RFRA, which is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is also on the board, right? RFRA basically applies the Sherbert law, the Sherbert test for federal laws. We have the post-Smith world in the federal context. We know exactly what it looks like, but New York does not have a RFRA, and California does not have a RFRA. Okay. As a general matter, a lot of really bad law was made during the pandemic. I think they want to pretend it never happened. Just forget about it. We just want to pretend it's never happened. I was involved in one of these cases. Oh my God, bring me back. At one point, the mayor of New York had this policy where if you were in certain zip codes, there'd be more strict COVID protocols. And then Cuomo said, no, we're not going to do zip codes. I'm going to draw a map. And he had his people draw these maps, these red lines. If you're in a red zone, you can have so many people in the church. In a yellow zone, whatever, in a green zone, better. And these were based supposedly on COVID numbers would change every 5 seconds, right? So what was remarkable, and just by the magic of coincidence, all the Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn were in the red zone, just magically, right? Just who'd think it, right? And Cuomo made these statements saying, you know, if the Jewish people don't agree, we'll shut them down. So this isn't the case. Shocking, right? He actually, one of his aides actually had a PowerPoint where this photograph of all these a huge Jewish wedding showed that people were gathering. It was like a 3-year-old photograph, right? It was just complete. Anyway, so I represented a Jewish school. We challenged Cuomo on a Friday, and by Monday, magically they redrew the map, so our school is no longer in the red zone. Just imagine, it's a miracle that happens, right? We see them on a Friday, and by Monday they redrew the map. They basically gerrymandered it. So our school is outside the red zone. Who'd have thunk? So that litigation didn't go anywhere, but a lot of really bad law was made during that time. So where are we now? Okay, so the majority says we're not going to rule Smith. We don't have to. I don't want to. Don't make me do it. Go away, you radical litigants, right? Leave me alone. And this is a 9-0 opinion. So with Roberts, if ever the price of getting a 9-0 opinion, it's to save Smith. That's what he does. He's very good at what he does, but it leaves law students unsatisfied. Kavanaugh and Barrett write this concurrence, and they're like, you know, there's some arguments maybe why Smith has to be overruled. Barrett's not persuaded by the originalist case that there's original meaning. She's not persuaded by it. She doesn't explain why, but she's not persuaded. But she says, what do we replace it with? You have all these questions that can't be answered, right? We're like Catholic social services. Does the church get it? What about the arms of the church? It use compelling interest test and so on. And she doesn't rule it. Okay. So Barrett is not prepared to overrule Smith. I have to say this. She's a Scalia clerk. She might be fond of Scalia's handiwork. A lot of people are. Curiously, though, the Catholic Church has never really come out against Smith. They haven't. They actually sort of support or oppose to RFRA in the early 90s. It's somewhat curious. And I actually asked a Mormon friend of mine, a former federal judge, about this. And he said that the LDS Church actually likes Reynolds. And I didn't know this. So Reynolds was 1890. That was the same year that LDS Church banned polygamy. I don't know if they're connected. I have to track that down. So they actually favor it. So it's not always obvious how various religious groups approach Smith. It doesn't always line up neatly. Okay. All right. So let's get to Justice Alito. He's not happy here. He is very unhappy. His concurrence is really a dissent, right? He's like, how could you not overrule Smith? We have the cases here. You sort of manufacture this distinction. Okay, so one of his more memorable lines is this opinion is written on a piece of disappearing ink on magic paper, right? Who am I up to? I forgot where I am. What's Alito talking about with the disappearing ink?
Well, there he was mentioning that they could eliminate the exemption power, and so then like the states wouldn't matter, and then what would happen if they eliminate the exemption power, then they're back at square one, where the city, or where they bring suit and they say this is violating Smith, we should overturn Smith, and the city says no, we like Smith, and they have to decide Smith eventually.
Yeah. So again, to the point of whether there actually is an exemption power, all the city has to do is say we will not ever grant any exemptions to anyone. And Adi, what would that do to the general applicability analysis?
And then it would be generally applicable because
Yeah.
so long as, or what is, he said something like at the very beginning, as long as any rule that categorically prohibits or commands specified conduct, or it will tolerate anything that categorically prohibits, as long as it doesn't target religious practice.
Very good.
That serves no importance.
Very good. So I actually looked up what happened afterwards. So I was curious. The city never changed the policy. So I think Alito might have been a little bit dramatic here. You can do that. And the city basically said, we will never enforce this rule against Catholic social services. So the entity still is providing placement services. They will not work with gay parents. Also, they won't work with single parents either. They'll only work with a husband and wife who are married. So the aftermath never happened, right? I think Philadelphia said, okay, this has gone long enough. Let's not risk another lawsuit. Let's just let them do their thing. If you're a gay couple in Philadelphia, there's like 21 other agencies you can go to. You're just not going to this one. Sort of like with a baker, right? Go anywhere else but here, which might not be satisfying to people who favor this policy. I think the city was afraid of further litigation. They just didn't want to risk it. Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, why doesn't the court just like worry about this in the first place and just let the court of public opinion sort itself out? Like, because even there wasn't ever like a real claim, like they hadn't actually.
It was manufactured. Well, I mean, look. So let me answer your question a couple different ways, right? One, no gay couple has ever actually approached this group to place a child, right? That's known. That's a fact. But you had members of the government sort of criticize the organization. So you ask, what's the basis for standing? But that was actually an issue, and they kind of just glossed over it. The government never took any action to deprive the organization of the ability to place children. This is sort of like Mastery's Cake Shop, where they say, well, none of our actually, 303, none of our actually to build a website, but I fear it might happen. So again, what we're seeing is the court's conservatives expanding a pre-enforcement challenge. That is, you're able to sue where anyone's actually been threatened you with action, which is the exact opposite, because decades ago, it was the liberals who wanted to make it easier to go to court and sue. You seem unhappy with that or unsatisfied.
I think it's silly.
Yeah, Jamar.
Isn't that kind of synonymous where, yes, minorities kind of got upset because they didn't even apply for loans because they feared they wouldn't have gotten
like redlining stuff? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good example. Yeah. So you had the testers, people would go into a loan office, apply for a loan, and when they got turned away, they could bring a lawsuit. Exactly. Good analogy. Yeah, there have been lots of strategies of getting something to court before you're ever actually threatened. And this is a case where, again, it's not clear. I think there was probably standing here, but I think it's a bit of a I won't say it's manufactured, but these are cases brought. I mean, who's Fulton, right? Fulton is Sharon Fulton. I can't remember her first name. Fulton was a woman and her husband who wanted to care for children. And they said, we want to work with Catholic Social Services, but the state won't even allow them to place kids through us. And that was the plaintiff. No one's ever been denied placement. No one ever asked them for it. So it's kind of all just, these lawsuits are developed in law offices and not, in reality. And, maybe let me just tease this point out as well. If you have loving foster parents, was the city really going to not place kids with them? I mean, just probably not. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, would they take this ideological point so far as like not, if they find a perfect match for a kid, right? We're not going to do this because of this organization. Maybe they would. I don't know. But yeah, you think so?
I don't think they would take it that far, and if they did, they should get placed immediately.
I think that's probably right. Yeah. So again, a lot of these, again, would anyone ever actually ask 303 Creative to build a website for a gay wedding. No, you're not going to do that. So a lot of these are trying to basically set precedents. Now, by contrast, the religious cases during COVID, those were real, right? Those were real because your people wanted to worship and pray and they were not allowed to. They would put police officers at the doors of synagogues to make sure that not too many people went inside. Right? That was real. That was an actual burden. But these cases, it's more abstract. You still don't like it. Sorry. It's what's called strategic impact litigation, right? Where groups on all sides figure out how to generate standing and get themselves into federal court to build precedent. It happens all the time, right? This is just that it's very rare. I mean, in the olden days, the way you would litigate is the government would arrest someone. You say, "Ha, my arrest was unconstitutional," right? Or you would say, "We're going to sue you and shut down your business," and you can challenge it. But now it's all pre-enforcement. We bring it in anticipation of litigation. No.
I just feel like unless you're acting like ignorant in some way.
You're a standing hawk. You like these strict rules of standing. That's fine. Julianne, is your hand up?
I'm gonna say, like, you mentioned a second ago that then wouldn't give foster children with single parents, but the facts say that they.
No. Catholic social services won't work with single parents.
So I think the fact states like, so the section from the beginning, it says specifically that they wouldn't work with same-sex married couples or unmarried couples.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right. I'm sorry. You're right. It was unmarried opposite-sex couples. I'm sorry. You're right. I misspoke. Thank you for calling me on that. You're right. No. I make mistakes. It's good. You definitely. It's a good lesson in life. Don't be afraid to call someone wrong, because very often it makes a person think more highly of you rather than less highly. So it's good. Okay. All right. So let's walk through the Alito dissent. Most of what Alito says is basically explaining why Smith is wrong. He goes into a lot of discussion of stare decisis. This is before Dobbs, by the way. So again, I think the court was also just realizing, okay, abortion is coming up soon. Let's not overrule another precedent. I think that's kind of lurking in the background, maybe. I don't know. Alito tries to show that there's some history to support the Sherbert test. He says it would not be end of the world if we brought Sherbert back. Talks about the COVID cases. One issue he raises that's important is how do you compare, right? And this came up in the House of Worship cases. Is a church like a casino? Is a church like a grocery store, right? What's the relevant comparator? When you get to this strict scrutiny approach, you have to make these very tough judgment calls of how to compare things that are alike and unlike. And Alito doesn't seem too troubled by that, but that's just sort of lurking in the background. Was that?
He's trying to find the dissent of someone.
It's Alito. It's called a concurrence. It's not a dissent, but he's basically dissenting. I'm sorry. It's basically. I mean, look, you wouldn't know this is a 9-0 case, would you? This is a 9-0 case where none of the court's liberals wrote separately. Sotomayor gritted her teeth on this one to save Smith. She gritted her teeth. Gritted? I don't know. She was gritting. I think gritted? Is that the past tense of grit? I think it is. Anyway. But Roberts, again, is good at keeping a majority together. When Alito dissents from Roberts, you know he just sort of made some stuff up to keep it together. That's what he does. Think of the Obamacare case. I can give you a list that's a mile long. Okay. All right. Gorsuch is also pissed. He actually, I mean, Gorsuch, love him or hate him, he's always very honest. And he tells you exactly what's on his mind. He has no tact. And he basically says the majority has a dizzying set of maneuvers, right? They're making up the stuff about the contract, they're rewriting the law, and they're adopting a position that no one asked us to, right? No one told the court, here's what you're supposed to do. And Robert just sort of made it up. He does this all the time. All right. So in the end, Philadelphia reached a settlement with Catholic Social Services. They will work with them, even if they refuse to certify same-sex or unmarried couples. Julianne's right. They will do unmarried couples. Okay. I'm sorry. They will do single individual gay and lesbian people, but not unmarried.
So their issue is not like sexual orientation.
It's not consistent with the teachings on marriage. That's right. Am I right, Joanne? Yeah. Well, what's curious, and maybe Catholics can correct me on this one. It's not the fact that you're gay is the problem; it's that you engage in this gay relations. Isn't that right? You love the sinner. Was it you hate the sin but love the sinner? So you can be gay but abstinent.
Essentially is what they would.
Also, it's more expressed. Like if you're letting a gay couple adopt, it's like very expressed. Like it's almost as if they'd be.
You're approving, yeah.
But if you don't, if it's a single person, you can't really say, "Oh, just play dumb." Though,
Yeah. All right, Aaron.
So taking Professor Sherman's Second Amendment class right now. So we recently read Bruin, and it seems like I'm kind of noticing a background in these cases of it's like, okay, well, it's not actually the religion. There's this background of gay marriage, and kind of what seems to continually come up with the Second Amendment cases is like, well, it's not the Second Amendment, it's abortion, or that's kind of the opposing view is, well, let's compare this like apples to oranges kind of situation. And so the reasoning in this case was reminiscent of the reasoning in Bruin about that government discretion. You can have government discretion, but it needs to be applied objectively. So I saw a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, Bruin was decided within about a year or so of Fulton, and this was just sort of this sharp change in the court's doctrine. I mean, in the span of a couple of years, the court decided Bruin, Fulton, Kennedy, and Dobbs. Like that changes like a quarter of my common law syllabus, like in 5 minutes, right? It was a very sudden change. And people, law professors have gotten over it. Oh, I can't teach this. It's not true. It's not law. So I got to deal with it. You got the Warren Court, right? Things change. Life comes at you fast, as they say, and that's what we got. Jamar?
We also pay attention to the conduct part of that case where they're talking about if they had to. The Catholic organization had to help all people, like everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation, that it would be going against what they believe and it would be forcing them to conduct an activity they don't believe in.
All right, I didn't ask this question. I'll ask this. Is this policy violating beliefs or conduct, Jamar? Yeah, sorry, you walked into that one. In other words, is this like polygamy or is this like just what you can believe?
It's more like polygamy.
It's a practice, isn't it?
Right.
Are they telling the Catholic Church what they're allowed to believe, what doctrine they have to accept?
Well, I think that's what they were getting at.
I mean, why can't you just tell them, all right, we'll stop fostering kids? No one's telling you what you can believe. If you want to believe in traditional marriage, go for it. But just don't foster kids. Don't approve these parents. Is engaging in acts of charity religious or something else? This actually came up in a Wisconsin case about a month ago. Are the actions of the Catholic Charity Services, charity as the name would suggest, is it actually the exercise of religion or is that just something else?
I mean, some people believe faith without works is dead.
Believe what's dead?
Faith without works is dead. I've heard that before.
Yeah. Well, at least the Catholic Social Services says that the way we actually practice faith is by action, which is why this line between belief and practice is always very shifty. All right. Anything else in Fulton? I didn't answer your question, no. I don't know. I think that we'll go back to Sherbet, right? No one was saying that Sherbet had to accept this government money. Oh, a good segue to the next case. But I think the general understanding is the denial of some benefit is itself a burden on the religion. In other words, saying we will not give you X benefit because of religion, that's the burden right there. even though there's no obligation to give the benefit in the first place, once it's offered to some, it can't be denied because of religion. I think that's the argument. You're not happy with my answer, are you?
I'm just, so we wouldn't be asking them to identify the conduct in that situation.
Well, the conduct here is helping loving parents find needy children, right? That's the conduct. But in the process, they're scrutinizing parents based on their sexual practices. Right? Is that wrong?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Whenever questions on the exam, that's my least favorite question in the entire history of education. Right? On the exam. All right. Can we go on? All right. Who's next? I lost track of where we are. All right, Nick. Let's go on to Carson against Makin. 2000. This is a brand new case. I've not taught this one before. 2023.
Yeah. So this was a case in Maine. Enacted a program that would fund tuition for people who are living in an area where I guess their school district didn't have secondary schools because Maine is rural and pretty spread out.
Yeah, it's sort of strange, but Maine, Vermont, people live all over the place, and there's not enough money to actually, not enough students to actually justify spending money on a school. So some areas had just no public schools at all. What is that, a heater? What is that?
Yes.
You that cold?
I was earlier and I took it from the PDP office on mine, and then I didn't have time to drop it off, and so now it's with me.
Okay, what is that? Okay, that's fine. Okay, go on. Okay, so what happened in Maine?
So the if you were a family that lived in one of those areas that didn't have a public school, you could choose to send your kid to another public or private institution. And if you did that, then the Maine government would fund the tuition for those private schools.
Okay, good. So this policy has been around for a long time, right?
Yes, like I think it was like before 81.
Okay, good. Oh, you anticipate my question. So at one point, was it possible to send that money to a religious school?
Yes, prior to 1981.
And what happened in 1981?
That's when it changed, and they.
Why did it change?
Maine imposed a new requirement that any school receiving the tuition had to be a non-sectarian.
Right. Why did Maine change the rule that religious schools were exempt?
It was because the Attorney General believed that giving funds to religious schools violated the Establishment Clause.
Okay. Cody, why would giving funds to this religious school violate the Establishment Clause? And again, you haven't said this yet, but you can just take a stab at it.
Because it's like, if the state is willing to give money to this organization, then the state is promoting the.
Now, who's actually giving the money to the religious school? Is it the state?
Taxpayers, or like the FAU here.
Right, but just be precise. Is the state writing the check directly to the religious school?
No.
What's the sort of process?
Don't they give it to the child? They reimburse the child?
Who's writing the check to whom? She said it.
I didn't hear it.
What is it, Shania?
Parents.
The parents. So the check goes to the parent. In other words, the parents pay for the school and they're reimbursed by the state. So there's actually no money flowing from the state to the school. It's sort of a workaround, right? We call it a voucher. Everyone here know what a voucher is, right? It's the state basically gives money to the parents. The parents can in turn use that to, spend at whatever school they want. Is that unconstitutional?
The voucher itself.
Giving the money to the parent who then in turn gives it to the school. Is that unconstitutional? No. So to be fair, in 1981, the court was in a very strong bend of anti-establishment stuff. So maybe in 1981 that would have been valid. But in a case called Zellman v. Harris in 2004, just mentioned the readings, the court said that this sort of scheme would be okay, right? That as long as the money is not going directly to the religious school, you're fine. But this goes back to the plane of the joints I asked Adi about maybe an hour ago, right? Even if giving the money to the parents is constitutional, the state may say, look, we're not sure, and we want to avoid any sort of conflicts. We're going to err in the direction of not providing the funding to religious schools, just out of abundance of caution, right? So then, Dylan, what happens here then? Because they decided not to give it to the religious schools. What happens?
Well, the religious institutions feel like they're being discriminated against.
Again, is there any sort of obligation of the state to fund private vouchers?
No, suspect that the non-religious institutions are having access to the same benefits.
Okay. So the argument is you have no obligation to fund religion in the first place, but if you do it, you cannot exclude religion from the pack. All right. Everyone see the facts. So there were a couple of cases, one of which is in your book, that are on point. One's called Trinity Lutheran, which was referenced in the reading. This was a case from Missouri. Missouri had a program where they would provide grants for rubber chips. If you go to a playground, like there's always rubber chips in the floor, so if kids fall, they don't scrape their knee. You know those things, right? Robert's, he's such a good writer, which like killed it, but he has this one line, like, these chips are good for scraping your knee. I can't remember the line. It's a good line. But if you were a religious school, you could not apply for this program for these rubber chips for the playground. And the court in that case held that was unconstitutional. Right? You could not automatically exclude the religious school simply because it was religious. But there was a footnote in that case that fractured the court. It was a unanimous decision, more or less. But there was a actually it wasn't unanimous enough. But there was a footnote in that case that drew a line between religious status and religious use. Religious status and religious use. Jacob, do you know the differences between those two items? This is discussed a lot in this case.
Well, religious status would be more like discriminating just because you're a religious organization, and then religious use was more like what the dissent thought was going on here, where they were sort of endorsing the practices, where if you give money to these schools who are teaching religion, then it's almost like the state's endorsing the practice.
All right, so let's use an easy example, right? I used this line years ago. What do kids do on a playground? Not a trick question. Is it a playground or a pray ground? I used that line years ago, right? When the government provides social services, let's use an easy example. Fire, police, right? If a church calls 911 to say, I'm sorry, we can't come to you right now because you're religious and we just don't want to get mixed up with religion. Would anyone think that's actually a good idea? No, that's ridiculous, right? Why? Because you're not basing this on anything the church has done. It's just they're in the society, they can get this benefit. If the government said we will not go to provide an ambulance to a house of worship just because they're a house of worship, that's discrimination on the basis of religious status, right? A religious institution will not get ambulances. I think everyone agrees that is a no-no, right? You can't do that. But religious use is a little bit different. What they say, okay, you know what? We will send an ambulance to the church. We will provide rubber chips for your playground. But we're not going to fund your schools because we know what you're going to do with that money. You're going to purchase Bibles. I mean, with the Trump Bible is expensive, but you will purchase other Bibles, right? Let's see this is a Trump Bible. I don't have a copy. My Trump shoes are on order. You know what they're going to do with that money. They're going to pay for religious texts. They're going to pay for teachers to, as Joseph Sotomayor says, indoctrinate the children. That's what she says, right? The money will be used for religion. So just to make this clear, the government can't discriminate on the basis of religious status. Everyone agrees. But the more controversial issue is, what about the money being used for religious use? and the government denied the funding for money being used for religious use to pay for a religious school. Everyone see the difference. So Trinity Lutheran had a footnote, I think it was footnote 14, but my memory might be off. And the footnote said, all we decide here is you can't discriminate on the basis of religious status. We don't decide the religious use issue. And who wrote that footnote? John Roberts. Did he mean it? Of course he didn't mean it. And you want proof? Go look at Carson against Makin. The guy is he's just a wizard, right? He just pulls wool over eyes, and that's why you have to call him out every time he does it. So Trinity Lutheran, again, they said, we're going to keep the status versus use distinction in play. Then a couple years later, we have another case from Montana. Espinosa versus Montana Department of Revenue. This was a weird case. I'll explain the posture. It's very unusual. The Minnesota Constitution had a provision called a no aid clause, sometimes called a Blaine Amendment. Don't you remember a Blaine Amendment? Right? There was a very famous senator, I think it was from Maine, Maine, named Blaine. He hated Catholics. He really hated Catholics. And he was actually worried that Catholics would take over the country. And so he basically favored these amendments that would prohibit funding of religious institutions, which might sound very neutral, but the only religious schools at the time were Catholic schools, right? So it was basically a way of saying, we're not going to fund Catholics. Montana actually has one of these Blaine amendments. It was reenacted in the 70s, so it wasn't the Blaine one, but it's the same idea. The state adopted this voucher program that provided tax credits, right, for private school tuition. The Montana Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional under the state constitution. That is, even if the Establishment Clause allows these credits, the state constitution does not. So the state Supreme Court said, we're not allowed to give these vouchers. So I'll go back to Cody. This was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. What the heck was the issue? The issue was that the ruling of the Montana Supreme Court was unconstitutional. You ever see that one before? That the ruling of the state Supreme Court interpreting the state constitution was itself unconstitutional. What made this weird is the state repealed the voucher program. The program didn't exist anymore. What the heck were they even reviewing? The court was deciding the constitutionality of a policy that was repealed. But it was repealed because the state Supreme Court said you had to. So this is a very weird case. We want to talk about standing, where it's not even clear how the court was reviewing a policy that was no longer being enforced. Or, maybe it wasn't repealed, but the AG said he wouldn't enforce it. My fact's a little bit hazy, but it's not important, right? The standing issue in that case was weird. But the court then held that the only reason you're denying these benefits is because they're religious, and they maintained the status versus use distinction. So they maintained the status use line in Trinity Lutheran. They maintained the status use line in Espinosa. Then we get to Carson versus Makin, and you can't avoid the issue any longer. Okay. So I want to come back to this idea, this interplay, this play in the joints between religion and free exercise. Who's next? Shania, what is Justice Breyer really worried about? He's very upset. Justice Breyer is a mild-mannered person. He's very upset here. What's bothering him so much?
I think that his problem is that Maine is trying to justify their policy by saying that they are trying not to establish any religion.
Breyer, the dissent I'm asking about.
Oh.
I think you're in the majority.
Okay, so here, his problem is that the majority is kind of straying away from this idea that a state may provide funding and is now instead requiring that states provide funding to religious teaching schools.
Why is Breyer so worried about this play in the joints? In other words, why is it good to give Maine this discretion, this leeway he describes it?
Because when you don't provide states with this breathing room, then you kind of are just focusing on exercise, and you're basically getting rid of this idea that the government shouldn't be establishing or promoting.
Excellent. Very good answer. Thank you so much. She's exactly right. What Breyer sees in the precedent is this play in the joints, which allows the states discretion, leeway, breathing room, to use her phrase, right? that if they're not sure if giving this money would violate the Establishment Clause, it's okay. Don't worry about burdening religion. The majority doesn't even mention the Establishment Clause. It almost never comes up. The majority seems to think that there's no downside to providing this funding. That the sort of the strife, I think Jacob mentioned strife earlier, right? That the strife is basically not even a real concern. That the people of Maine don't like funding religious schools. Kevin, I'll ask you this question. What option does Maine have if they don't like funding religious schools? What might they do? What does Robert say?
Stop funding private schools.
Period.
Yeah,
Stop. Yeah.
If they want to fund private schools and they want to give public money to private schools,
Good.
they can't discriminate against
Right.
just the religious schools.
Yeah. In other words, the court tells them if this is so important to fund schools, you must do so without regard to religious basis, religious status, religious use. He'll even mention, well, maybe you have more school buses, right? Maybe you have more transport, put kids in buses for 2 hours to go to school every day, right? But the upshot is, if you're going to fund some schools, you must fund all the schools. And that's the lesson from the COVID cases, from Espinoza, from Trinity, and so on, that whatever benefits are given to non-religion must be given to religion. And even if the money is being used for religious use, you still have to give it on an equal basis. Cody, did you hand up?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, it's okay. You're allowed to have opinions.
I don't understand how saying that you can use the money for any religious school. It goes towards establishing a union religion. If you're not saying like you can only use this money for a Christian school, or you can only use this for like a school, like
Well, go back to the memorial remonstrance, right? Remember James Madison? What was that issue about? It was attached to the funding of teachers or religion. Can you see why giving money to a religious school might create an entanglement between church and state? Do you see the issue? You're shaking your head no.
I just don't understand because that's not what's happening. There's no schools and they're giving these parents money to send their kids to school, and then the parents are just happening to choose a religious school. They could choose.
Okay, so let's play this game, right? I'll play. Oh, let's play this game, right? So, can any school sign up to be eligible for these vouchers under the plaintiff's theory?
I thought so.
I mean, does a state have any power in vetting whether a school should be eligible to receive these things, putting apart religion? Does the state get to review their lesson plans? Yeah.
It briefly talked about that, but it just talked about all of the.
Yeah, ignore Roberts.
There's no.
Yeah, just ignore him. It's not important, right? Would the state have to vet whether a school is suitable? Do they have to review their curriculum, review their lesson plans, make sure that their teachers are actually teaching properly? Like any institution getting government money can be inspected, right? Then you can send inspectors into the classroom to see if people are learning what's required by the state. So we'll do a case next week called Lemon against Kurtzman, which was a law for about half a century till a couple of years ago, actually a year ago or so. And one of the concerns is, even if there's no risk of establishing religion, the entanglement between the government and religious institutions is so risky, right? This one's going to blow your mind. I was going to do this next week. We'll do it now. The argument was keeping money out of religious institutions protects religion. What?
Government money?
You heard what I said. It's the exact opposite of what you might think today. Just keeping money out protects religion. Why? Once religion becomes dependent on state money, religion can become corrupted. So the way to preserve religion, they argue, is to keep it separate. Who favored the Blaine Amendment in Montana in the 1970s? It was the church. The church says nothing good comes with putting government money into religion. Keep it separate. That's what Madison argued in the Memorial Remonstrance. Right? It's the exact opposite of what the Roberts Court says today. Roberts Court says is if there's some benefit, you must give it to religion. But the philosophy of the Lemon Test was no. The way we preserve religious liberty is to keep government out of religion. And even if a house of worship wants that money, it's not good for you. We know better. Oh, wait a minute. Right. So that's the problem, right? If any religious school doesn't want the government money, they can just say, no, thank you. We don't want it. What happens here is these churches want the money and they're not being allowed to get it. So does the court say, we know better, right? We know based on history what happens when you merge church and state. So no, we're not going to have this money. I'm sorry. Ooh, I was going to do this next week, but a week early is fine. Yeah, the entire philosophy of the Establishment Clause is the opposite of what we hear today, right? People believe that the way you preserve religion is to keep church out of it, keep state out of church. And today, it's almost the exact opposite. You need to have more funding of religious institutions to keep religion safe. People are shaking their head yes and no. You want to comment? I'm happy to hear both sides.
I know, I read the majority, I thought it was pretty easy. They were just saying you can't discriminate, that rule that we just got. But the Senate made it really convoluted.
It's like a different world, right? The majority and dissent live in these different universes. They're looking completely different ways. The tension, my first question for Amy an hour and a half ago, right? The tension between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause keeps Justice Breyer awake at night. And he fears it. John Roberts couldn't care less. Right? He sees no problem with having this funding go to the church and to these religious schools. Cody?
So you talked about like we fear like the entanglement between church and state, but until you've actually crossed the line, like entangling isn't unconstitutional until you've actually crossed the line of establishing religion. You haven't violated the Constitution.
Does entanglement happen in a day?
No, I
It
mean
might happen gradually over time.
right, but until you actually cross the line, have you violated the
But once you cross the line, maybe it's too late. Right. So look, the word entanglement, you're right, it's not in the Constitution, but the Lemon test, which we'll talk about next week, this was a test the Burger Court created, saying we cannot have excessive entanglement of church and state. That's the line and true. Julianne?
Along the same lines, so like establishment is happening over one specific act that the government comes out and says, okay, it's official, we are a Christian nation.
Hallelujah.
It's on
Right.
our
Yeah. We'll put in God we trust and money, right? Like, no, just kidding. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. It's incremental. You're exactly right there. That was a big glib, but yeah, we one nation under God, right? No, you're right though. The fear of Justice Breyer and the Burger Court was this things happens over the course of generations, right? And we're so fearful what happens if we corrupt religion. We need to stop it now from happening. It's a prophylactic, if you will, right? It's to prevent it from happening in the first place. Anyone else on this one?
It does more damage in some way because then since the government can have nothing at all to do with religion, you can't touch it whatsoever. Like they have to act like it.
Oh, if you look at European nations, this state has no funding of religion. Religion exists in these sort of these enclaves, and religion doesn't bother them. They don't bother religion.
They also have less religion. People are significantly less religious.
Well, this is a point that's worth addressing in different contexts. Historically, it was the government that wanted to support religion, and the courts saying no, you can't. But in Maine, it's the opposite. It's the government saying we don't want to support religion. The court saying you have to. Let's say that one more time. Historically, it was a more conservative government saying we want to support religion, and the court said, no, you can't do that. That's a mistake. And today, you have these more secular governments saying we don't want to support religion, and the court saying, no, you gotta do it. So it's complete 180 where we once were. In some regards, the court is the last institution in these sort of jurisdictions that would actually protect religious liberty, precisely because the people there see no value. And let me just make this point expressly. While this case was pending, the Maine legislature passed a law. There's a footnote about it that I wrote, but it's not in the opinion. And the Maine legislature said, okay, fine. As a condition of accepting these vouchers, you must comply with our public accommodation law. And what does that mean? You cannot discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation. And guess what all these Christian schools do? They don't hire teachers who are gay and lesbian. So in other words, they put a poison pill in there. It's like, okay, you want this money? Same as Fulton. You have to abide by public accommodation law. By the way, no exemptions. Everyone's subject to it. No carve-outs. So I actually emailed First Liberty and Beckett this afternoon, just checking on it. These cases are still pending. So even after Carson, you think, oh, wow, this is this great victory, right? No. None of these schools got a penny because they won't comply with the public accommodation law. And actually, a federal district court judge in Maine ruled against the First Liberty case about a month and a half ago. finding that, well, this is a generally applicable law. It's a discrimination law. There's no exemptions under Fulton, so religion you lose. So all of this amounted to almost nothing. The First Circuit will affirm, and the Supreme Court will deny cert because they don't actually care. Right? They just like sort of signaling. They like signaling, but they don't actually care about actually cleaning up the mess. They'll just, oh, whatever. People mean go learn on Zoom or something, right? Was it?
Brings a case with no real people, no.
Yeah, and no real resolution. It's just something for students to learn about in class. It's very unusual. But yeah, the upshot is you have a state that really does not want to give this money to this religious school, and they found a way to do it. And so this decision will not amount to much. Okay. Let's see, what else I want to talk about. All right, so the holding here in this case, which Roberts repeats over and over and over again, is that you cannot discriminate on the basis of a religious status or religious use. They sort of conflate those two together. And the mere fact this money will be used for some sort of religious purpose doesn't matter. Breyer is just absolutely incensed. He's like, how can it be that a generation ago, this policy of the court's mandating would be unconstitutional? In other words, what is required today would have been unconstitutional 20 or 30 years ago. And he's just sort of apoplectic. He also says the majority doesn't discuss all the precedents, doesn't discuss Locke v. Davey, doesn't discuss a host of these other cases. Again, this was a 2023 case. This was after Kennedy v. Bremerton, or maybe it was about a week before, but which overruled the Lemon test. So it's all around the same exact time. Okay. All right. Any questions in the majority or the Breyer dissent? Justice Sotomayor, again, what a difference 5 years makes. She worries that this will basically lead to like, the Handmaid's Tale, right? That this will lead to basically this theocracy in which religion must be treated favorable above all else, and that if Maine denies tuition because of their affiliation, they'll basically be forced to fund what she calls indoctrination. So it's often described this as the court has 6 Catholics. Sotomayor is, to be sure, Catholic by birth. She describes herself as a lapsed Catholic, so the count is not exactly right. And Gorsuch was kind of raised Catholic when I was Protestant. So there's only one Protestant in the court, as it's currently constituted. I'm not sure what Justice Jackson's religion is. I actually have to look that up.
She's Protestant.
Is she Protestant?
I just Googled it.
Oh, you read my mind. Yes. So I guess we have one more Protestant in the court. Okay. All right. Questions on this? All right. So let me just package this class up and go a few minutes early. The religion clauses, again, are premised on this sort of this tension where the more you protect free exercise, the more you sort of inch into an establishment clause violation. And the more you try to avoid an establishment clause violation, you inevitably burden religion, right? You can't do both. And for decades, the court's preference was to focus on avoiding establishment clause violations. And now the preference is to focus on avoiding burdening the free exercise. And that's sort of where we are. Next week, we will study a couple cases, the syllabus right here. We'll study a couple cases on the Establishment Clause. Lemon v. Carson, sort of the canonical statement about entanglement of religion. Another case, Town of Greece versus Galloway. This involves prayer at the opening of a government meeting. And there's actually a very long history of tradition of these sorts of prayers. In our last class, we'll do 2 cases which were decided a couple years apart. American Legion involves a World War I memorial in the shape of a Latin cross in Maryland. And we'll do Kennedy v. Bremerton. This is about the football coach that was praying. That's it. Anything else? I'll see you all next week. If you have any questions, please come see me. Have a good day.
Oh, yeah.